The royal guards at Buckingham Palace are more than just soldiers. They are living symbols of British tradition, duty, and history. When you think of a royal guard, what comes to mind? Most people imagine tall men in red coats and shiny black hats, standing perfectly still in front of the palace, with their eyes focused straight ahead. They don't move, they don't smile, and they certainly don't speak to anyone. To many tourists, these guards seem like statues. But behind that stern and serious appearance is a story of dedication, discipline, and respect. One such guard is Private Jameson, a young man in his late 20s. Jameson has been assigned to stand at Buckingham Palace for nearly a year. He knew that being a royal guard wasn't just about looking impressive in the famous uniform. It was about maintaining an almost unbreakable sense of discipline. His job is to stand at attention for hours without moving a muscle, no matter what happens around him. The uniform is heavy, the days are long, and the crowd of tourists can be overwhelming at times. But for Jameson, it's all part of the responsibility. Every morning, Jameson rises early, puts on his uniform with care, and checks himself in the mirror. The red coat, black trousers, white gloves, and tall black bearskin hat all need to be perfect. He straightens his posture, takes a deep breath, and mentally prepares for the day ahead. He knows that people are coming to see him, and that he has a duty to perform. His role is simple: stand at attention, look straight ahead, and never break character no matter how difficult it gets. To some, this job might seem easy. After all, it's just standing still, right? But in reality, it's much harder than it looks. Jameson is not allowed to move or show any emotion. If he even so much as blinks too much, someone in the crowd might notice. If a tourist tries to take a picture, he must ignore them. If someone shouts a silly joke or waves their hand in his face, he cannot respond. It's all part of the Royal Guard's code. Over time, Jameson has learned to block out the distractions around him. He focuses on his breathing, his posture, and the rhythm of his thoughts. He knows that his job is important, not just for the sake of tradition, but for the history that comes with it. The Royal Guards are the face of Britain's proud military past, and Jameson takes that responsibility seriously. Despite his best efforts to maintain the stoic exterior, there are days when the crowd is especially loud, and the constant clicking of cameras and the shouting of tourists can make it harder to stay calm. Some people try to joke around, thinking it's funny to see how far they can push the guards before they break character. There are those who try to make them laugh or move by doing silly dances in front of them or making funny faces, but Jameson has learned to ignore it. He knows that it's all part of the game, and it's not worth losing his cool over. However, there are moments when Jameson feels the weight of the crowd's attention more than others. It's during these times, when the tourists gather in larger groups and the noise becomes almost unbearable, that he has to remind himself why he's there. The Royal Guard's role isn't just about looking impressive for the tourists. It's about representing something bigger than himself, a symbol of the country's strength, stability, and history. The stoicism is not meant to seem cold or unfeeling. It's meant to show control and respect for the traditions that have been passed down for centuries. But no matter how hard Jameson tries to maintain his focus, there are always moments when the line between duty and personal feelings becomes blurred. He's just a man doing his job, after all. He's not a robot, and sometimes he feels the strain. It's during these moments that he wonders about the people around him. What do they think of him? Do they see him as a statue? Do they wonder if he's even real? Some days he has to fight the urge to look around and see who is watching. It's strange, really. Here he is, a man in the prime of his life, and yet he spends hours each day staring at a single spot in front of him. There are times when his mind wanders and he starts thinking about his life outside of the palace gates. What would it be like to be free of the uniform? To walk through the streets of London without feeling the eyes of hundreds of people on him? Could he ever just be himself again? Or would he always be the man in the red coat and tall hat, the royal guard who could never break character? But those thoughts are fleeting. When Jameson feels his mind start to drift, he shakes it off and refocuses. He has a job to do, and he knows it. He reminds himself that the history of the Royal Guard stretches back hundreds of years, and he is just a small part of that history. He's carrying on a legacy that has been upheld by men and women before him. Every time a guard stands watch, they are honoring the past while continuing the tradition for future generations. And so, Jameson stays focused, standing still in front of Buckingham Palace as thousands of tourists pass by. He sees the excited faces of children who point at him in awe, the curious stares of adults who wonder what it's like to live a life like his. and the many visitors who try to get him to crack a smile or show some emotion. But Jameson stays steady. He's been trained for this. It's his duty. Some people don't understand why he does it. Some people wonder how he can stand there for hours on end, with nothing but his thoughts for company. But for Jameson, it's not just about the job. It's about something deeper. It's about the sense of pride he feels knowing that he's playing a small but important role in the country's history. The uniform represents more than just a job. It represents an unbroken line of tradition. It's about something that goes beyond him as an individual. The tourists come and go, and the crowds grow and shrink with the passing hours. But Jameson remains at his post just as every royal guard before him has done. He doesn't move, he doesn't speak, and he doesn't react. For Jameson, there's no room for anything but the duty at hand. The world around him may change, but for him, this moment is timeless. As the sun begins to set, casting long shadows over the palace grounds, Jameson knows that his shift is coming to an end. He can hear the sound of footsteps approaching, signaling that his time standing at attention is nearly over. But for now he remains still, focused on the present moment, knowing that tomorrow will be another day of standing watch. The job never changes, and neither does his commitment to it. Tomorrow, the tourists will return, the noise will start again, and the cycle will continue. But Jameson will be there as he always is, doing what he's been trained to do, because for him it's not just a job, it's a duty, and duty is something that he takes very seriously. The sun was beginning to rise higher in the sky, casting a warm glow over the streets of London. The day was just getting started, and already a crowd of tourists had gathered outside Buckingham Palace. Some were taking photos of the impressive building, others were laughing and chatting excitedly. But the one thing that all the tourists shared in common was their fascination with the Royal Guard. It was a spectacle in itself. A man, standing perfectly still in a red coat, black trousers, and the iconic tall black hat. For many, it was the highlight of their visit to London. Private Jameson stood at his post as he had done countless times before. His eyes were fixed ahead, his posture perfect, and his mind focused on the task at hand. It was the same routine he followed every day. But as he stood there, the sound of footsteps, whispers, and the clicking of camera shutters filled the air. Tourists were everywhere. Jameson had grown used to the crowds, the constant noise, and the feeling of eyes watching his every move. But what he hadn't quite prepared for was what would happen that day. A group of tourists, loud and full of energy, had gathered right in front of him. They were a mixture of teenagers and adults, all laughing and trying to get the perfect shot. Jameson could hear their voices, muffled but persistent, as they whispered among themselves, planning how to get him to react. It wasn't the first time this had happened, of course. He'd dealt with tourists trying to get a rise out of him before, but today felt different. The group was bolder, more determined to see if they could break through his discipline. One of the young men in a bright red t-shirt suddenly stepped forward. He smiled at his friends and pointed at Jameson. "Hey, let's see if we can make him smile," he said, his voice loud and filled with mischief. His friends burst into laughter, clearly excited by the idea. Jameson remained unmoving, his eyes fixed on the spot just ahead of him. He knew this game well. People liked to try to make him smile, or even worse, make him react in any way. But he wasn't going to let it happen. He had trained for months to keep his composure, and he wasn't about to lose that control now. The young man wasn't discouraged. In fact, he seemed to find Jameson's lack of reaction even more amusing. He stepped closer, standing just a few feet away from the guard. "Come on, man. Don't you ever get bored of standing still like that? You look like a statue," he said, grinning widely. His friends giggled in the background, clearly enjoying the sight of a guard who wasn't playing along with their antics. For a moment, Jameson felt a flicker of irritation. He had heard similar comments countless times before. He knew that to the tourists he might seem like just an object to be entertained. But he also knew that if he let his frustration show, it would only encourage them to keep going. So he did what he always did. He blocked out the noise and kept his gaze fixed ahead, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him react. But the young man wasn't about to give up. He crouched down in front of Jameson, making exaggerated faces in an attempt to get the guard to break. He pulled his ears back, puffed out his cheeks, and even stuck his tongue out, all in the hopes that Jameson would flinch, smile, or show some sign of emotion. The crowd around them began to grow, with more tourists gathering to see what was happening. Some took out their phones hoping to capture a picture of the royal guard finally cracking under the pressure. The more the young man exaggerated his actions, the louder the crowd became, and the more determined they seemed to be. Jameson's mind began to race, but his body remained still. His breathing was steady, his muscles tense but under control. He focused on the sound of his own heartbeat, trying to drown out the noise around him. He had been in this situation before, and he knew that the key to winning this silent battle was not to give in no matter what. He couldn't afford to let a few loud tourists make him lose focus, but despite his best efforts, the young man wasn't backing down. He kept at it, his antics growing more and more ridiculous. At one point, he even tried to dance in front of Jameson, moving in exaggerated slow-motion steps. He was clearly trying to make the guard look foolish, hoping to catch him off guard. The crowd roared with laughter as they watched, thoroughly entertained by the spectacle. Jameson's mind began to wander, just for a split second. He couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to simply break character for once, to give these people the reaction they were so desperate for. Just a small smile or even a little chuckle would be enough to shut them up. But then he quickly reminded himself of the importance of his role. His job wasn't about entertaining tourists or making them laugh. His job was to stand guard, to be a symbol of dignity and respect. If he lost his composure, even for a second, it would break the illusion, and that was something he couldn't allow. Just as he was about to refocus, the young man took things a step further. He started to wave his hands in front of Jameson's face as if trying to block his vision. He moved from side to side, his actions growing more ridiculous by the second. The crowd was in stitches now, some people laughing so hard they could barely breathe. But Jameson remained still, his face as impassive as ever. Still, there was a small part of him that wondered how long he could keep this up. The longer he stood there, the more the crowd seemed to grow. It wasn't just the group of teenagers now. Other tourists had started to gather around, taking videos and photos. Some of them whispered to each other, wondering if they'd ever get to see a royal guard break character. As the minutes stretched on, Jameson felt the pressure building. The noise was deafening. The faces in front of him blurred by the movement, the constant flash of camera phones. But he stood firm. He wasn't going to let them win. He wasn't going to give them what they wanted. Finally, the young man, realizing that his efforts were in vain, gave up. He stepped back with a frustrated sigh, and his friends followed suit. The group of tourists, though disappointed, seemed to respect Jameson's dedication. They muttered to each other, impressed that the guard had not reacted at all. But just as they were about to leave, the young man turned back one last time. "Man, you're a legend," he called out to Jameson. "I don't think I could do that. You're like a statue or something." Jameson didn't respond, but his mind felt lighter. He had won. The guard had held his ground, and the crowd had finally lost interest. As the tourists began to drift away, Jameson stood tall, his body still rigid, his mind calming down. He had made it through another test, another challenge. But even as the crowd dispersed and the day wore on, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. More distractions were bound to come his way, and he would have to face them all the same way, with silence, focus, and unyielding determination. The crowd around Jameson was thinning, as it often did in the late afternoon. Some tourists had come and gone, snapping their photos, laughing, and moving on to the next stop on their busy schedules. But as usual, Jameson remained at his post, standing tall and still, his eyes fixed on the spot ahead of him. For him, the day was drawing to a close, but it wasn't over yet. Jameson had been on duty for nearly 6 hours at this point, and the exhaustion was beginning to set in. His legs were sore from standing in the same position, his neck ached slightly, and the weight of the tall bearskin hat on his head seemed heavier than ever. He reminded himself that this was part of the job. He had trained for it, and this was his duty. But there were moments like this one, when the silence and stillness became harder to endure. Suddenly, a small voice cut through the buzz of the crowd. It was high-pitched and curious, coming from a little girl no older than 6. Jameson could hear her speaking to her mother just a few steps away. The child's words were soft but clear, cutting through the noise like a ray of sunlight. "Why don't you ever smile?" the girl asked, looking up at Jameson with wide eyes, her innocent curiosity hanging in the air. Jameson's eyes softened just slightly, though he kept his face as neutral as possible. For a brief second, the world around him seemed to slow down. This wasn't a joke. It wasn't a prank or a challenge. It was just a simple question, one born out of the purest form of curiosity. And for the first time in a long while, Jameson was caught off guard. It wasn't that he hadn't been asked questions before. Tourists often shouted random things at him, asking why he was standing still or how long he had been there. Some asked him if he ever got bored. Others made comments about his uniform or the fact that he looked like a statue. But this question was different. It was honest. It wasn't about trying to make him react or getting him to do something unexpected for their own amusement. It was genuine, a reflection of the girl's innocent wonder. Jameson could feel the tug in his chest. He had trained for this moment just like he had trained for every other moment. But this was new. A child with no idea of the years of tradition and discipline that came with his role was simply curious about something so basic. Why didn't he smile? His eyes flickered downward for just a moment, catching a glimpse of the little girl's face. She was small, her hair neatly tied back in pigtails, her face filled with innocence and wonder, the kind of wonder that Jameson had almost forgotten about. Her question had a simplicity to it that reminded him of things he had once known but had long since buried under layers of duty and tradition. For a moment he felt a tiny crack in the wall he had built around himself. "Why don't you ever smile?" she asked again, this time with more hope in her voice, as if she believed there might be an answer to her question that could make everything make sense. Jameson took a deep breath, trying to center himself. He could feel the weight of the question and the pressure to maintain the stoic facade that he had carefully built over the months. But he also knew that he couldn't ignore the pure, untainted curiosity in her voice. He wasn't just standing here as a figure of authority or tradition. He was a person too, a human being standing in the middle of a busy square, in the midst of thousands of people, who was still capable of feeling. His lips parted, and before he could stop himself, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. It was brief, just a flicker, but it was there. The girl's eyes lit up when she saw it, and for a moment time seemed to stand still. She beamed, her face full of joy as if she had just uncovered a secret that no one else knew. The mother, who had been watching the exchange with interest, gave a soft laugh. "See, I told you he could smile," she said, her voice warm and amused. Jameson's gaze drifted back to the little girl who was still smiling up at him, her eyes wide with excitement. It was a simple moment, one that most people wouldn't think twice about, but for Jameson it felt like a small crack in the armor he had been so carefully constructing. It wasn't a big smile, not the kind you would expect to see in a social situation or even a moment of joy, but it was real. It was a smile of connection, of humanity. It was the kind of smile that reminded Jameson of something important, that there was more to his role than just standing still. For a few seconds, Jameson allowed himself to savor the moment. It wasn't a break in character in the way that people expected, nor was it an outburst of laughter or a sign of weakness. It was simply a quiet acknowledgement that he was more than just a guard in a red coat. He was a person, capable of feeling the warmth of a genuine connection even if it was fleeting. The girl, still watching him with a bright smile, turned to her mother. "I knew he could smile," she said triumphantly. The mother smiled back, nodding her approval before gently guiding her daughter away from Jameson. As they walked off, Jameson stood there, his thoughts still lingering on the brief exchange. He had broken character just a little bit, but not in the way most people thought. It wasn't about losing control or giving in to the distractions of the crowd. It was about something deeper, an understanding, however brief, that even the most disciplined and stoic person could be touched by the simplicity of a child's question. Jameson felt a small weight lift off his shoulders, a moment of relief in a long day of standing still. He looked around at the remaining tourists who had begun to move on, their attention turning elsewhere. The noise and the laughter still filled the air, but the world around him felt quieter now. The little girl had reminded him of something important, that there was more to life than rigid duty. That sometimes the best moments are the ones that surprise you, the ones that make you feel human again, even when you've spent so much time trying to be something else. For the rest of the afternoon, Jameson felt a shift within himself. The next time a tourist shouted a silly question or tried to provoke him with a joke, he found that he didn't mind as much. He didn't feel the same pressure to remain perfectly still, to keep the strict boundaries he had once set for himself. Instead, he realized that it was okay to acknowledge his humanity, to remember that there was room for moments of connection, even within the framework of his duty. As the sun began to set and his shift came to a close, Jameson stood tall one last time, his thoughts drifting back to the little girl and the smile that had briefly crossed his face. He knew that the world would keep moving, and that tomorrow he would be back in his uniform, standing at attention once more. But for now, in this moment, he allowed himself the comfort of knowing that even a royal guard could break character, just a little, and still remain true to his purpose.